ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for being here at Cleveland High School in Rio Rancho. I'm joined today by law enforcement leaders and educational leaders, not only from the metro area, but from around the state, to highlight one of the critical things that I think we need to do in terms of improving public safety and improving the educational experience for children in every community. And that is to address a growing problem that we have in our community about the revolving or relating to the threat of mass shootings. For a variety of reasons, we have seen an increasing number of threats of violence and the use of guns in our schools. And that is having not only a traumatic impact on our teachers and our children, but it is having a profound impact on our public safety professionals. Every time there is a threat, either online or over the phone or in some other context, law enforcement has to respond, because we know that what tragedy may ensue from not responding is too great a risk for us to take. Unfortunately, in the state of New Mexico, we currently treat threats against our schools as misdemeanors. And I don't think that is in alignment with where we are as a community. I think most people recognize that even a threat is something that's going to have a tremendous impact on young people. It's going to have a tremendous impact on teachers and educators. But more than that, it is simply, I don't think, a reflection of our community values that you can make that kind of threat against a school and walk away with a misdemeanor. There's also an important legal aspect of the proposed change to move the penalty for a school threat from a misdemeanor to a felony. And that has to do with the way we treat juvenile offenders in our state. Most people are unaware that under the Children's Code, whenever a misdemeanor crime has been identified, the JPO, the department within or the unit within CYFD that evaluates whether or not and how to resolve some of these questions, they can actually resolve up to 3 misdemeanor cases informally. That means without referring to the prosecuting authority. So oftentimes, prosecutors and district attorneys are simply unaware that a misdemeanor threat of this type has occurred because it can be resolved informally. I don't think that's appropriate. I think we need policymakers in Santa Fe and adults to be consistent in how we treat these types of crimes and these types of offenses. In other words, we routinely talk about the threat of gun violence. We see repeated actions in Santa Fe geared around gun safety, and we need to be consistent in how we treat this type of criminal behavior. So the proposal that we are making today, which has been graciously supported and will be sponsored by Representative Joy Garratt, is to increase the penalty from a misdemeanor to a felony for making a threat against a school, and by doing so, make it easier for law enforcement to engage in investigations by securing search warrants. Oftentimes, judges are reluctant to approve search warrants for misdemeanor crimes. By making this a felony, it removes that potential barrier. And number 2, by making it eligible to be charged as a felony, it ensures that prosecutors and district attorneys will be aware that this conduct is occurring, and it will no longer allow for this conduct to be resolved in a way that is not reflective of the harm and the danger that's associated with it. But I think it's important for you to understand not just the perspective of prosecutors, but the perspective of frontline law enforcement officers. They routinely are called upon to react and respond to these threats, and I'm proud to be joined by them today. I'm going to invite Chief Steele, Rio Rancho Police Department, to give remarks, and then we'll hear from other law enforcement leaders and education leaders from the state. Chief.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Hey, good morning. So I just want to briefly touch on how this impacts the, I will say, the Rio Rancho Police Department, since that's where I'm familiar with right now. So not everybody realizes the number of these type of reports that we get, whether they come in social media wise, whether they come in phone call or in person. But the impact that that has is chaos. It causes chaos in the community. It causes chaos within the schools, and quite frankly, chaos for our educators. So why this is important to me to get this bill passed is by making it a 4th-degree felony, it does open up investigative options for us that we don't currently have now. It makes that path smoother. But children, to me, are our most valuable asset. They're our future, and we have to protect them. So not only do we have to protect them, but we have to protect the people that are educating our children. So we need to do something to put some teeth into this, because quite frankly, right now, I feel like it's almost a catch and release. I hate to use that term, but that's what it is. There's no consequences as I see it. So what this does to us, our response, it takes resources, many resources. The number of resources kind of vary on what type of complaint or threat that comes in. If it's social media, it's a little less resource driven, but we still go out and investigate it to the best of our knowledge, right? The best we can do. If it's a phone call or whatever, then we send officers not only to the school, you know, we're going to homes, we're doing all kind of follow-ups, and then if it comes in person and it's an active threat, then we also risk the lives of officers responding to that call quickly, and risk the lives of the community in general as we're responding. So this is serious. It may, you know, some people may say it's only a threat. Well, we never know when that threat is real, and we have to investigate everything as it is real. So by putting the teeth into this, I believe it will definitely help us in all aspects of our investigation and hopefully knock these threats down. So thank you for that. And with that, I would like to introduce Albuquerque Police Department Chief Harold Medina.
Thank you.
Thanks, sir.
You know, the truth is, these incidents affect all of the community. And you know, we have educators up here, we have law enforcement. The Albuquerque Police Department investigated 28 of these incidents in September. That's 28 times the school was disrupted. I recently had a conversation with a friend of mine, and he was getting ready to send his kids to school. There's a shooting threat at the school that this individual's kids went to. His kids chose not to go to school that day. That day, that family was impacted by parents who had to figure out what they're going to do with their kid and not go to work. And we consistently see this within the ranks of our employees at the Albuquerque Police Department, where parents are trying to make the decision to get to work or to make sure that their kids are home safe. I know that there will be critics who say increasing penalties always doesn't lower crime. I've heard that for 30 years. No one item is going to decrease crime. It's about us creating a system of accountability, creating a culture where individuals know they're going to be held accountable and that there's repercussions for what they do, and making sure that we could follow through with that. There are other things that we still need to do above this. You know, it's no secret in the Bernalillo County, we've struggled for a year in booking juveniles because it always seems to be full. No one thing is going to change something, but not doing anything isn't going to change anything. And I think we need to remember that we need to start making changes. This is a great step forward. This is about rebuilding the criminal justice system. This is about us getting consequences for those that are impacting all of the community and bringing a sense of security to our individuals who have chosen to be educators. I have 2 educators in my family, a daughter, a son-in-law, and actually a sister, 3. Every one of them is concerned about this topic and how society has changed over the last 10 years. So I want to thank everybody who supports this legislation. I want to thank you for your bravery in pushing this legislation forward, because it's not always popular. And I want to remind everybody in the community and everybody at the state legislature, if we do nothing, nothing will change. And that's what's been done too many times. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sal Maniaci. I'm the Executive Director of Safety and Security for Rio Rancho Public Schools. And I want to talk to you folks this morning about what the impact is in the learning environment when we receive these school threats. You know, whenever a school threat occurs, it does create a significant disruption to our learning environment here at Rio Rancho Public Schools, in addition to creating an emotional burden on our students and our staff and the community at large. Seems like anymore, every week, we receive at least one school shooting threat at one of our schools, whether it be a high school or a middle school. Our schools have very high populations. This school has almost 2,700 students. So think about it, it's almost like running a small city. When these shooting threats occur, what happens is that our administrators, instead of trying to enhance the learning environment and make the school a better place for our students, now they're now working on this incident with safety and security and the police department to mitigate this situation. Now, we all know, as the two chiefs explained earlier, these threats come in usually on social media or sometimes through the phone. And what happens is that we'll get these calls sometimes at 12 o'clock midnight, 2 o'clock in the morning, and that's when the coordination effort begins. Because if we receive a threat, we reach out to our partners in law enforcement, we start developing a plan to deal with it that next day. If the police department receives the threat, then they do the same for us. They contact safety and security department, and we do our best to put together a plan to make sure that that next school day, our kids are safe when they come to school. So I'd like to talk about some of the things that happen when we receive these threats. What we do is we examine the situation, we determine what the appropriate security protocols may be, and they maybe include deploying security officers to certain areas around the perimeter to make sure our perimeter is secure, keeping students and staff safe in the buildings, and then sometimes putting a lockout situation where we don't allow any visitors or contractors enter our campus. There are times that the situation could be to the point where we have to initiate a lockdown, and that's where we're actually asking our staff and students to remain in secure rooms so we can mitigate the situation. But nonetheless, like the chief said, every threat is taken serious, every threat disrupts the learning process, and every threat has a tremendous amount of resources that's required to mitigate that threat. So I want to thank, first of all, I want to thank Chief Steele for his efforts with the Rio Rancho Police Department. They've been great partners for us. I want to thank the school administration for supporting security in our district. And then I would also like to thank Representative Garratt for doing this for us and support us for championing this change, because it needs to happen. I've got 30 years of law enforcement experience, and I think it's about time we take this serious. Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce Superintendent Suman.
Thank you all so much for this opportunity, and thank you to Attorney General Torrez and also Representative Garratt for inviting teacher and administrator voice into this conversation, because we're directly impacted. As you know, 27 of New Mexico's 33 counties are rural, which means our response time can vary anywhere between 8 minutes and 25 minutes. So this is an equity issue when we talk about our students here in New Mexico. We already talked about the academic learning impacts that happen when kids can't come to school, and we know what happens when attendance leads to graduation rates. But have we talked about the financial impacts? Have we talked about that every time there's one of these swatting incidences, and that's what they're called, every time there's one of these, it costs our district or our schools tens of thousands of dollars in wasted meals, in bus runs that are fuel that we can't pay for because kids aren't at the bus stop, in teacher salaries, heating and air conditioning rooms where there are no students. Then we talk about the force that we have to pull into our law enforcement partners and having to pull them off of their duties, especially in tribal and rural communities. We have to have MOUs with our tribal police in order to have them help us. But most important to me, as an educator, as a mother, our children have a destroyed sense of safety. When your kids don't feel safe, they can't learn. It assassinates the soul of a community when you're too scared to send your kids to school. And if you're a community member who is a laborer and you have to go clean houses and your husband has to be a custodian and you don't want to send your kid to school, how are you going to make your bottom line? Something has to be done. We have to accept that being 46th in population density and 4th in gun violence is adversely affecting our children. And that whoever you were locked down with for those 2 to 3 years, depending on what community you're from, and how well they were able to relate to what happened in COVID is severely affecting your ability to cope right now. And their access to guns is outrageous. Our own Principal Vigil, who is now the Associate Superintendent of the Milwaukee Valley Schools, had his life threatened 3 weeks ago by a student, 13 years old, threatening to kill him by gun violence. Thank goodness for our security detail, Mr. Johnson, but just like all other schools in New Mexico, we are competing for resources. We are trying to hire security guards at $16 an hour, which is how much your juniors in the city are making at Wendy's. We are trying to outfit our schools with cameras and bulletproof glass with funds that we don't have. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak about this with you today, and I'm grateful that we've been invited into the conversation. Please push this forward and help us heal. Thank you. I'd like to introduce Representative Garratt.
Thank you. I'm really honored to be here. I'm frankly feeling very emotional. I represent Westside, Bernalillo County. This is already a bipartisan effort. I've spoken to State Rep Brian Baca, who's a champion for school safety from Las Lunas, and he can't be here with us today because he's the deputy superintendent. No child should fear going to school because they might get shot. And what's amazing about this law is that we're changing one word, misdemeanor, to 3 words. We're changing one word, misdemeanor, to 3 words, 4th-degree felony. And that will have an incredible impact, as you've heard from all of our law enforcement. Our kids need to feel safe at school. Just last September, almost 2 months ago, my own high school in my district, Volcano Vista High School, had an incident where a student brought a loaded gun in his backpack and had a gun in his car. It's close to all of our homes. Cleveland students' lives were disrupted by a fellow student shooter back on February 14th, 2019. Kids were traumatized. I remember that date because we were presenting the red flag bill, and that morning we heard about this was the anniversary of the shooting at Marjorie Stoneham Douglas High School that killed 17 students and teachers and injured 17 others. So it's relevant across our country and across our state. Our kids and our educators deserve to be kids, to walk the halls of their schools, to play on the playground without worrying about guns and violence. We shouldn't be having to train our kindergartners in Alice how to be alert and how to prepare in case a shooter gets into your school and you have to have a lockdown. I spoke with a woman recently in my neighborhood, and after I left her house, her 4th grade student chased me and said to me, "Can you do something about guns at school? We're afraid. We don't feel safe in our school." Our kids need to feel safe in order to learn. As I said, this is a bipartisan concern and a bipartisan effort. It's going to happen in 2025 in January and February. I want to close with a final thing. Aztec Police Chief Mike Heel always kept students, Casey Jordan Marquez and Francisco Fernandez, both 17, who were killed in 2017 at Aztec High School. And so as I give my remarks, I want you to think of those 2 precious students who were the victims of gun violence in their school by someone who had made previous threats. So thank you for being here together. It does take a village. It takes the state, the county, the city, the law enforcement of every branch. It takes us all to get this done and to take it seriously. So in memory of those 2 Aztec students and in the hope for the safety of all of our students, we will get this bipartisan law passed. Thank you very much. And I turn it back to the AG.
So as you can hear from the comments that were shared by frontline educators and law enforcement professionals, this is the kind of common sense change that I think all New Mexicans can get behind. There is simply no excuse to threaten a school, to threaten gun violence, and it's time that our law makes it abundantly clear that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated. It will be prosecuted as a felony, and it will correct what I think is a deficiency in our legal framework, which doesn't take this kind of conduct seriously enough. I will note, as Chief Medina made reference, my mom was an Albuquerque public school teacher, and the impact and what we expect of our teachers when to come in to these classrooms. I want everyone in our community to think about what it would be like to ask a loved one to come back into one of these schools. the day after a threat, when they don't really know what's going to happen next. There is no excuse for this behavior, and this is the kind of thing that I think, as Representative Garratt noted, is a bipartisan issue. It's an issue that people can and should get behind, and so we're proud to help craft the legislation and offer our support. With that, I'd open up for any questions you may have.
So there's obviously buy-in across the board with all of you standing up there. My question is, how do you get the kids to buy in? How do you get the kids to realize what a misdemeanor is versus what a felony is? Will I actually get punished for this? Will I go to jail, whatever it may be? How do you get them to stop?
Well, listen, part of our job, not just as policymakers, but as parents and as responsible adults, is to demonstrate that we mean what we say, and that if we talk about, as Representative Garratt talked about, how serious this conduct is, we need to match our response with a level of seriousness that frankly we currently don't have. The chief talked about it when I was the district attorney in Bernalillo County. I remember vividly a moment where an Albuquerque police officer apprehended a young man who took a loaded firearm to school, and you can actually see that police officer with this young person in custody negotiating with someone from JPO on whether or not that person would be taken into custody. And at the end of that conversation, for whatever reason, JPO would not authorize detention. And while that involved taking an actual weapon onto a campus, what it does is it's emblematic of a larger problem, which is you are sending a signal every time the system fails to respond appropriately. In other words, what do you think that young person tells other kids in the school about what happened to him when he brought a gun? If the answer is nothing, then you are sending an unequivocal signal. The same thing is true when it comes to threats of violence. If you make a threat of violence and it ends up being a misdemeanor and nothing happens, you will then create some space for these young kids to start thinking, well, these adults don't really mean what they say. And it's time for us to be unequivocal and clear about, the values that we have. And Representative Garratt talked about some of the gun safety legislation, which I supported. And frankly, I think, unfortunately, we've seen a tendency in Santa Fe for people to get on board with gun safety, but not as supportive of actually holding people accountable when they break the law. That has to change. That has to stop. And our job is to be consistent with young people in the message that we deliver about what's acceptable and what's not.
So in the past 4 years, there has been plenty of proposals of stricter penalties for criminal threats, and they failed to go through. What do you think is going to change for this January, February time this time around?
Well, look, I think there's a growing awareness and consensus that we need to be proactive about changing our legal system to better reflect the way our constituents think about these things. And the legislative process is a difficult one. I don't envy Representative Garratt and the chore that she will have and the challenge that she will have in lifting up this issue and other issues. But I think one of the most important things that you're seeing here is that, as Representative Garratt noted, this is a bipartisan effort. This is something that is going to have broad bipartisan support. One of the unfortunate things that I have seen, and I think Chief Medina made reference to it, is for reasons that I have a hard time justifying or explaining, public safety proposals that have widespread public support die in the legislature because there's certain narrow special interest groups that control access to committee calendar time, to debate. And I think if the legislature engages in good faith in actually debating these issues, not tabling them, not pushing them aside, not deciding not to give them a vote, actually have elected representatives stand up and justify why they don't think this should be a felony, I think we'll get to the right place. I think people have grown tired of a lack of action. And in my conversations with Representative Garratt, but also the speaker and others, there's an awareness that things need to change in Santa Fe, and I'm hopeful that that will happen.
Go down the line here, Kayla, do you have one?
Just for clarification, this will be on the table for the next legislative session, correct? And then, you know, if it does pass, how immediately will it go into effect?
So it'll be sent to the Legislative Council Service for drafting. It'll be sponsored and introduced by Representative Garratt, probably with some bipartisan support, perhaps Senator Baca in the other chamber. It will go through that process. All general legislation of this type usually takes effect in the summer following, so usually in July will be the effective date of the legislation should it pass.
This is a great idea, but if the juvenile code does not get upgraded, this fourth-degree felony, we've seen the process with juvenile detention and the constant cycle of it. Would this be a failure if the juvenile code doesn't get updated along with this bill?
Well, look, I think Chief Medina made a very good point that if you take one proposal in isolation, that in and of itself is not going to change the trajectory of the community with respect to our public safety challenges. You have to look at how each of those pieces work in conjunction. I am deeply concerned, as I know Chief Medina is, as I know the district attorney is, about the capacity issues that we have in our juvenile detention facilities. As I understand it, more than half, or right about half, of the available space for juvenile detention is being occupied by people charged with either murder or serious violent offenses. That's a very troubling statistic, and so I think the legislature is going to have to take a more comprehensive view about all kinds of investments that they make. But it isn't just about updating the children's code. It's about how do you intervene upstream. In other words, and you know, we had a conversation earlier today about something that we have talked a lot about amongst law enforcement professionals and educational professionals for quite some time. We also need to start thinking about what's going on in the homes where these kids are coming from, which is why the problems that we're having in CYFD is absolutely connected to this conversation as well. There are lots of people in disrupted, chaotic, traumatized environments, people that have, that are living with addicted parents that don't have access to rehabilitation, kids that are in homes that are dangerous, that we haven't effectively removed from danger. So I agree that we need to have a comprehensive approach, but this is an important aspect of a much larger conversation that I hope will not get overlooked.
Dan?
Yeah, I've got two, just one is kind of a clarification, but the code that you're talking about changing, would that be for all types of public shooting threats or only in schools? I mean, are we talking courthouses and other public places too? Or?
Yeah, so what it does is it changes the definition effectively of a terroristic threat. Right now, for reasons that are kind of hard to explain in the piecemeal way that this was done, bomb threats are currently considered to be felonies, but threats of violence involving a firearm are classified as misdemeanors. So it levels the nature of threats so that anything that would lead somebody to believe that there is imminent threats of mass violence of any kind would be treated equally. With respect to the previous question about the juvenile code, this isn't necessarily about the juvenile code per se. What it does is it interacts with the juvenile code, because what we're doing is by changing the definition of this crime from a misdemeanor to a felony, it has an impact on how the juvenile code is applied with respect to misdemeanors, because misdemeanors can be resolved informally up to 3, but felonies cannot. In other words, right now, threatening to shoot up a school with a weapon, because it's classified as a misdemeanor, can be resolved by JPO without any notice to prosecutors. And I think that creates a real problem in terms of identifying patterns of behavior with specific kids that are in desperate need of intervention.
Thanks. And my other question was just, you talked about this as a growing problem, and I think Chief Medina cited some numbers in Albuquerque. I was wondering if you had any data kind of statewide as far as how many of these threats we're seeing, and how that maybe compares to, 5, 10 years ago? Or?
No, we don't have that data yet, but part of the impetus for this change was frankly in direct conversations that I was having both with the FBI and with the Albuquerque Police Department about how many times they were being called out, and I know the Rio Rancho Department's having the same issue. And I think that's another important element, is we should go through the process, and I hope the committee who's engaged in this process will actually endeavor to reach out, not just to urban school districts, but to rural school districts, because you have to think, we have fewer resources there. We have fewer educational resources. We have fewer law enforcement resources. And so there are some redundancies and some scale that a bigger department like Rio Rancho Albuquerque Police Department, as impactful as it is, they can absorb some of that. If you're talking about a rural community with a sheriff's department with a limited number of deputies, you're going to have a profound public safety impact if you're redirecting limited law enforcement resources away from rural communities that already don't have enough. And so I think that's another important piece of this, is that it isn't just an Albuquerque problem, it's a problem that's impacting schools across the board in every corner of the state.
We'll do the last question in-house with you, Julie, and then we've got one on the Zoom.
You mentioned CYFD a number of times. Is that another group that is bought into children's code changes, this change, or is that a hurdle that you'll have to meet and legislators will have to meet come January?
My sense is that there's a growing frustration with the lack of progress and the lack of improvement in the department. And I think, I can say that my agency is increasingly concerned and looking at it very carefully. I am concerned about the number of times that we have children who may be in danger who are not removed from that danger. One of the most startling things that I learned when I was district attorney, there was a study on adverse childhood experiences and trauma. And what that study showed is that by the time a child had ended up in custody in that detention facility, they had been the subject of more than 9 CYFD referrals before they themselves became the subject of criminal investigation. That shows the direct link between a lack of effective management of CYFD and the downstream impacts on public safety. And I don't think that's something that anyone can ignore. I think we have a system that has prioritized, in my judgment, for too long, this sense that family reunification rather than child safety should be the top priority. I think that's upside down. I think child safety, child well-being must be the top priority. And I think a fully staffed and functioning CYFD is a critical component to making sure that this doesn't happen. Because what I can tell you is that if we have the opportunity to talk to our educators and talk to our law enforcement officials about where these threats are coming from, almost uniformly, they're coming from kids that are living in environments that are impacted by lots of trauma and lots of destabilizing forces from addiction, abuse, lots of things like that. And what we have failed to do is identify those kids, not when they're 15, 16, and 17 and threatening a school, but when they're 4 and 5 and 6 and they're witnessing abuse, they're victims of neglect. There's a direct connection between the kids that we fail to help when they're young and what manifests itself in criminal behavior when they're much older. Our job as law enforcement professionals is at a certain point, start really holding them accountable without any excuses, but also pointing policymakers to the long-term institutional impact of failing to have an effective system to promote child welfare and child safety. Thank you very much. We really appreciate your time and attention to this. We'll stick around for questions. Thank you.